listening to the Traditional Outdoors Podcast.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. I'm running solo this week as it just so happens it's spring turkey season in Michigan, and my buddy Nick drew a tag this year, so congratulations and good luck, buddy. But rest easy, as we still have a great show lined up for you, and I know I'm sure excited about it because for the past couple of weeks I've had fly fishing on the brain, and it's largely because of this week's guests. Tonight, I'm joined by Cameron Mortenson. Cameron owns and maintains the website, the Fiberglass Manifesto. And honestly, the first time I visited the site, I probably spent a few hours reading through articles and just simply taking in all the fantastic photos he has on the site. Now, you can find his website at the fiberglassmanifesto.blogspot.com. And of course, we'll have a link to the website within the podcast notes as well as on our website for you to find later. Now, in case you haven't figured it out from my intro, Cameron's website is devoted to fly fishing and fly fishing with fiberglass rods specifically. And to be honest, that's what really drew me in because I couldn't help but think about the parallels of fishing or fly fishing with fiberglass versus graphite and how that somewhat compares to bow hunting with laminated bows versus modern equipment, sort of an old school approach. So I just had to have him on the podcast. I reached out to him, invited him to be on the show, and he's waiting on the other end. Welcome to the show, Cameron.
How you doing? Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. Glad to have you. So I guess let's just kind of jump right in here, and I'm going to have you start out by telling, how you got into fly fishing. How long have you been doing it, and what drew you to the sport?
Well, I guess I've been fly fishing now since I was in high school, and I grew up in Michigan, and I spent summers in northern Michigan working at a summer camp just outside of Grayling. And, I didn't grow up fishing that much. My dad just didn't have an affinity for it or the patience. The few times that we fished as children is usually when we were camping on camping trips, and we'd catch bluegills, on worms. And then when I started working at summer camp, there was a lot of people that I worked with that were really into fishing the lake that was there on the camp property. And there was bluegill, and there was largemouth bass and smallmouth bass and phenomenal pike in the lake. And so I kind of got just really into fishing, spin fishing, for a number of years, and then just interest in what fly fishing was about. And that part of Michigan has a lot of fly fishing culture and history, and fly shops and sport shops where there's fly rods and flies, and it's just a big deal up there. And so after working at summer camp for a couple of years, I went into Skip's Sport Shop, which was just outside of Grayling, and been in there a couple times. And I was a poor high school kid, and I don't know if it was Skip or somebody that worked in the shop, but they had seen me come into the shop several times, and I kept picking up this Eagle Claw Featherlight fly rod, and they had a whole outfit. So you got the fly rod, you got a Martin, what I know now, is called a tuna can type fly reel with just a very simple level line on it. And I think it was the third or fourth time I was in the shop. I think there was a $60 price tag on the outfit. And he said, "You really want that fly rod, don't you?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And I said, "But I don't have all the money for it today. I think I had $20. And he said, "Well, how about you give me the $20? And I told him that I worked at Camp Asable, which is a Christian camp there in Grayling. And he said, "I know you're good for the rest of the money. Just come in through the summer and just keep paying on it." And so I took that fly rod. I think he gave me a handful of little foam flies for catching bluegill, and I started spending any free time that I had at camp just learning how to cast, learning how to play fish on the fly, and just kind of dove completely into it. Being self-taught, I didn't have a lot of confidence, and so I spent that first summer just fishing on the lake. So even though there's world-class fly fishing for trout just across the street on the Asable River, I really just wanted to do my time and get comfortable learning how to cast and try to gain some confidence. Also, this was pre-internet, so I spent a lot of time at the library, just grabbing every book, every magazine that I could to learn how to fly fish, and just had a great time that first year. And spent the next summer, I started going across the street to the Asaba River and caught my first trout on the fly, and it just kept growing from there. So it was my first experience in fly fishing, and then it was my first experience fishing a fiberglass fly rod as well.
That's very cool. So there's a couple of things I'll bring up there. One, I've never lived in Michigan, but Nick is from Michigan, and a lot of my hunting friends are in Michigan. And of course, you probably already know this, that Grayling's kind of the mecca of our of the traditional bow hunters because of Fred Bear. But another funny thing there is Tom Jurgensen, who's another close friend of ours, who's actually kind of my co-host at large, and I'm going to introduce him on the podcast in a couple of weeks. But he loves fishing the Asaba River, so that's very cool. Now, do you only do fly fishing these days, or do you still fish with some other gear as well?
Well, you know what? I mean, when I got into fly fishing, I really got into fly fishing, and so I really put spinning rods away and fished that glass rod for the first, year or two, and then put it away because everything I was reading was saying I should be fishing graphite. And so for the next 10 or so years, got different graphite rods, didn't fish any glass. And then, outside of fly fishing, was dating my wife. We got married. We moved to Colorado. We lived out there for about a year and a half. And then we moved back to where she was from in South Carolina. And one day through the gear closet, and there was this bright yellow fly rod. And I was like, oh, man, that silly Eagle Claw feather light was back there. And I was like, well, I didn't have a lot of confidence in what glass was. And so I was like, I can fish that on the pond. That'll be fine. And picked it up and started casting it. Just realized, how awesome, glass was to cast and to fish with. By then, the internet was in full force. So I was able to find the Fiberglass Flyrodders Forum. And I just dove deeper and deeper into fiberglass fly rods. During that entire time, I was not really spin fishing at all. I don't even know if I had a spin rod. But then our first child was born, and had a friend of mine build a fiberglass fly rod on a Lamaglass blank that was a fly spin. So you could set it up with a light spinning reel, one of the trigger cast Zebcos, or you could put a little fly reel on it. And so that was kind of jumping back into spin fishing a little bit as our daughter got a little older and we could fish with crickets. And then our son came along, and he's gotten really into fishing as well. I would say most of the time I'm fly fishing, but it's been really fun to cast a spinning rod again, and not always under the guise of I'm doing it because the kids are doing it. It's fun just to go down there with a spinning rod and mess around with a worm or a lure and kind of relive some of the things that I did 20 some years ago when I first started fishing.
Sure. And anytime you can do anything like that with kids, it doesn't matter what the tackle is. I saw that you had posted on your blog today about the crickets and fishing with the kids. And in fact, I'm not sure if you listened to our podcast last week, but we had a custom knife maker on last week. And of course, now I go and look at the article that you just posted and fell in love with that fillet knife you had in that article. So yeah, I'm gonna end up with another knife soon, I can tell.
You need to get one of those. It's such a perfect knife for filleting small fish, and I really enjoy the work of Woody, and he does a great with his knives now, and just his quality and the story behind it, his work is pretty neat.
Yeah, like I said, I clicked on it this afternoon, and I'm definitely going to be following up with it probably tomorrow. So, I guess you give us a little background regarding the Fiberglass Manifesto. Something. How long since you created the blog, and really what was the catalyst that got you started doing the blog?
So I mentioned it just a few minutes ago that I became a member of the Fiberglass Flyrodders Forum. And at that point, the forum had been around several years before I was on it, but there was less than 300 members. In fact, I think I was the 260th member. And it was really primarily the membership was guys that fished vintage glass. There wasn't really a lot of options for contemporary glass at that point. You had a couple custom fly rod makers, and you had a couple of companies that were making glass rods along with graphite and bamboo. And so became a member there. It's a really great forum, and if you're not familiar with it, it's one that I always recommend to anyone that's interested in learning about glass, or let's say they found a fly rod in their grandparents' house, or I've had several people that have contacted me about they've opened up a safe, a family member safe, and they found multiple fly rods in there, and they wanted to know the history and the background behind it. And so really dove deep on the forum, and we used to have a Sunday night chat session where guys would just stop in after 8 p.m. and for 2 or 3 hours people would catch up. And one of the guys on the forum was a rod builder, but he was also in law enforcement in Wyoming. And my employment is in law enforcement in South Carolina. So we really hit it off. And one night we were talking back and forth, and we were starting to see more rod builders that were coming to the forum, and there was more things going on with contemporary glass. And this was almost 10 years ago. So flip style online magazines were just coming kind of on the scene. And Mike was like, you know what? It would be really cool if we had somewhere to talk about more kind of spread interest in fishing fiberglass rods, but then also what all the different builders and makers were doing. And at this point, there was probably less than a dozen builders and makers. But that conversation in the forum kind of grew, and I asked him, I'm like, well, what would we call it? And he's like, the Fiberglass Manifesto. I mean, he already had the name, on his mind, and I was like, well, that's a very cool name. And then the nature of his work, he didn't really have time to do anything with it, and I didn't really think about it too much for a couple months, and then one night we were in the chat room. I was like, I don't know if either of us have the background to do a flip style magazine, but maybe I could try to start a blog. And I really didn't even know what a blog was at that point either. And I asked him if he was okay if I used the name, and he's like, yeah, go ahead. So did a Google search for how to start a blog, and Blogger came up, and signed up for a site, and just was completely lost. Didn't know what I was doing. Just started writing, and would put something up every 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 days. I just didn't have a schedule, didn't really know what I was doing, but just started talking about glass. And I really thought at that point that I was going to run out of things to talk about. There wasn't that many builders, there wasn't that many makers. There was an interest in contemporary glass, but there just wasn't that much of it out there. And over time, I mean, now if you jump on the site and you look on the glass builders portion, I mean, there's 60 or 80 different builders and makers now. So it's pretty exciting, and I don't think I'll ever run out of things to talk about. Like, probably blogs will end up being what they are today, run out of things to talk about, because there's guys out there that are doing new things every day, which is really, really cool.
Well, and I've noticed, so I have looked at the list that you have on the site, and I can tell you, and I'll get into that probably in just a minute as well, as far as my what my research has led me to over the last couple of weeks. But there's a lot of small independent rod builders out there that are building fiberglass rods as well. So it's a lot of them are not well known. They're just small, what I would call like mom and pop shops, which I like to support. I do have some questions around that. But I'm gonna try to circle back around to those in a minute. But now, on top of, first of all, before I get into that, I will tell you the blog is fantastic. I mean, I could literally spend probably another 40, 50 hours or more just trying to get caught up, and the photography is fantastic. The articles are great. I know you've done some contests in the past, but outside of your blog, I know you've been on Orvis's site through some interviews. Headhunters Fly Shop, Fly Fish Ohio is a lot of them, just going out and doing a search on your name. You can find a lot of other sites that you've contributed to as well. And I know you're also a member of the Outdoor Writers Association. So, what else, where else have you written and been published?
Well, you know what, for someone that doesn't think of myself as a writer, and I don't think of myself as a photographer, I guess I've always looked at this just as a really fun hobby. And, working in law enforcement, one of the things that I promised myself early on in my career was that I didn't want to get completely sucked into that bubble. Because I've worked with guys and girls where their whole life is that job. And everyone they hang out with is a part of that job. And everyone, their kids are friends with, other cop kids, families. So it's very, you're in a bubble, and I don't know if it's always healthy just to be in one bubble. And so what this website's given me, and just fly fishing in general has given me, an entirely new circle to hang out with. And it's, along the way of writing the website, it's given me opportunities to travel. It's given me opportunities to fish with different fly fishing guides. Even ones that, weren't too sure about what glass rods were. And it's been fun to put a glass rod in their hands and, have them, they might not give up their graphite rods, but, they see a place for it. And I think they get a kick out of some of the fish that we've caught on glass rods over the years. And so it's been a neat process. And along the way, it's been pretty neat to be a part of a lot of different conversations about fiberglass. And, I guess to back up just a little bit, I'd written the website for a couple of years, and I really didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I was having fun putting content together. It was a niche website. It was very much about fiberglass fly rods every day. But there was kind of a turning point where there was a rod that Scott Fly Rods announced at IFTD. And the day that it was announced at IFTD, I ended up getting all kinds of different messages on social media and email like, what is this? Like, people expected me to know what this rod was. And I had zero idea what this rod was. I mean, I was learning about it the same time as everyone else. And so it was kind of an aha moment for me that if I was going to be a resource for those that fish fiberglass fly rods, that I needed to do my work, and I needed to put my detective hat on, and I needed to start making contact with every rod company, every rod builder, and if I'd gotten a rumor of something, I needed to follow up on it. And so fast forward to the next year, about the same time, I went to IFTD, and I went booth by booth, and I met hundreds of people that first trip. I gave away 300 business cards. By the end of day 3, I was completely hoarse. I still remember speaking to Ray Jeff at the Echo booth, and I had forgot what I was going to say next. I mean, I was just completely spent. Hey, I apologize, but I am done, and he totally gets it. I mean, by day 3 of those shows, you are pretty spent. But it really it opened a lot of doors as far as it gave me a new network in the industry. And the next year I went back to the show, and instead of giving away 300 business cards, I only gave away 75 business cards because I was meeting the same people over again for the most part. And the next year I gave away 25 business cards. So, there was that progression where it was giving me that opportunity to start working within the industry. And it really started a lot of different conversations with different rod companies. So companies that had never offered glass were starting to ask about it. Companies that had offered glass in the past but wanted to bring it back, wanted to talk about it. And then there was just other people that were curious. And so it's been it's been a very neat ride to get phone calls from different rod builders, to get emails, and just being asked from time to time, what do you think about this? Or I'm going to send you some prototype rods for you to play with and just give me feedback. it's been an honor, and it's been actually very exciting to kind of be a part of the conversation of contemporary fiberglass for the last 10 years.
Well, it shows. I mean, obviously the passion in the website comes through, at least to me. I'm gonna give you a little bit of backstory on me that you don't know, because we've only had a couple of quick chats on a cell phone. But my story is very similar to you. I think I picked up my first fly rod, and it's been longer because I'm older than you. But when I was probably 10 to 12 years old, saved, and we had a little Gibson's department store that most people have never even heard of Gibson's. But if I remember correctly, it was an 8-weight. It was a fiberglass rod because that's all there was, unless you bought bamboo, and I sure couldn't afford that. But and it came with a tin can reel, much like what it sounds like you're talking about. It was horrid, but I taught myself how to cast it. And ended up catching trout on it several years later. But it was a horrible rod. So, when I could afford it and bought better stuff, of course, by then graphite's on the market, and that's what everybody's buying. And that's what I had. And when I found your website a few weeks ago and got looking, I was like, this is just intriguing. It's everything. It's the old school approach to doing something. It sounded like there was valid reasons why in some cases fiberglass would be better. So I had been planning to buy a little 2-weight and was doing some searching on Facebook and so forth, looking at different options. And I think I had asked in a group a question about a couple of different 2-weight rods and so forth. And this guy messaged me and said, I've got a 2-weight. And it has an Able TR1 reel on it. And come to find out, it was a 7-foot 2-weight. 7-foot fiberglass 2-weight. And I'm like, okay, sold. I'll take it. And it arrived a week before last. I couldn't go fishing because of tax weekend, so I had to do my taxes. But last weekend, I hit a stream with it, and I fished till it was just too dark to even cast. I had the best time with that little 2-weight rod, and ended up managing, some 12, 14-inch trout. And on a 2-weight in some of the water in North Georgia, man, all I can tell you is it was a ton of fun. I can't wait to get back with it. So, and I've obviously read a lot. I've listened to some other podcasts that you were on, but for our listeners, can you go into what a person who's accustomed to fishing with modern rods can expect from a fiberglass rod? What are the differences? What are the advantages? Anything else that you would like to add just about the allure of a fiberglass rod or modern fiberglass rod?
Well, I think that you did it the right way when you circled back on it. So when you left it with a horrible 8-weight that was probably just dreadful to cast. And then you came back to it with something that was probably very exciting to fish with that 2-weight. And there's a lot of people that I'll get emails from that will ask about like first, and it would be I wouldn't be doing anyone any favors if I said you should go grab an 8-weight or a 9-weight or a 10-weight glass rod as your first look into what glass is, because that might be so foreign to what they're already fishing in that line weight that they might not enjoy it. But it shines in what we kind of call the trout weight. So 2, 3, 4, 5-weight rods is a great entry into what glass is. Advantages of glass. I think they're great tools for new casters because you can feel the rod flex. And the story that I always tell is that the pediatrician, our pediatrician who I became friends with, he was a fly fisherman, and so we got together one evening after work, and we were on a local tailwater here in Columbia, and I had a 8-foot 5-weight glass rod, and he brought along his fast action 3-weight and graphite rod. And so we fished, for an hour or so, and I was like, hey, you should just try casting this rod. And he did one back cast, and then he laid out like 30 feet of line. And he just yelled out of the river. He's like, whoa. He's like, I could feel the rod load. I mean, it just blew his mind that just that little bit of just one back cast, and then the rod just did all the work. And it just really it quickly showed him like these can be really fun to cast. And when I say that they're good for a new caster, a lot of times graphite rods, you can't feel that rod load. Or the tip, it's a tip flex rod, and so most of the rod doesn't really move without, really putting some energy behind it. And so putting that full flexing glass rod in their hand, they can feel that rod back cast, and then it's learning their timing with it. And so I think they end up being really great tools to teach casting. And I think they're great in the hands of somebody that knows how to cast. I mean, I've seen many a caster. Maybe I can't do it, but they'll pick up a glass rod and they can lay out an entire fly line with it. You just learn your timing with it, and they're wonderful casting tools. And even more than that, I think that they have a lot of benefits when it comes to fighting fish. You can fight the fish over the entire plane of the rod. You can put a lot of leverage on them, especially when it comes to big fish on light tippet. You're using that whole rod as a shock absorber. And I fished in northern Georgia and in North Carolina where, it might be 6 and 7X tippet. It might be little midges. And it's very rare that I'll break off a fish off on glass, just because that whole rod is just so forgiving. And then on big fish, I mean, everything from redfish to carp to muskie to pike to bonefish, you can really leverage on large fish. You can really turn fish because you're using that entire rod to make, to put power on that fish. And it's still, you've got that shock absorber effect where your chances of breaking a big fish off, I think, go way down. And then, I fish glass from a 1-2 weight all the way up to 2-handers. And I fish 8, 9, 10, and a 12 weight for, big fish species. And sometimes it's very specialized. When you start doing muskie, when you start using sink tips or full sinking lines, I think there's benefits in using glass as well, because if you learn that timing, the rod is going to cast those really heavy, oversized fly lines, and it's going to turn over big, oversized flies. I think so much easier than graphite. A few years ago, I went and fished in Hayward, Wisconsin for muskie, and if you are not casting or moving that fly through the water, you're not going to catch a fish. I mean, it's typically not a sight fishing game. You are just covering a ton of water, and it's casting, and you're going to be worn out at the end of the day. I mean, even where I feel like the rod's doing a lot of the work for you, moving that line through the air, you're still going to be worn out. But on that trip, the guy that I was with, he handed me a rod that he was working on, a graphite rod that he was working with a rod company with. And he's like, here, cast this and tell me what you think. And I had to use so much of my own energy to lay out line with that graphite rod, that super fast action rod, that I was glad to pick up my slightly heavier in weight, like in your hand, but the rod just did so much more of the work. So there's advantages there. And lastly, when you hook up a fish on glass, and I'm sure you felt this with that 2-weight on some of those larger fish, it is just a hoot to catch fish on glass. I mean, you can feel their head shake all the way down on the cork. The cork is bending, with the rod, and I don't think there's a more fun fly rod to catch fish on than glass.
Oh, I can tell you, I was laughing out loud. I mean, I was having an absolute blast, and I was by myself. I didn't have anybody fishing with me, but I was ecstatic. The closest I can say I've come to that is, I've got a 3-weight. Now it's not fiberglass. It's a St. Croix Legend Ultra 3-weight, and that has been my favorite rod and reel combo up until last weekend. I think I may have found a new favorite. So,
but that St. Croix isn't a very fast action rod. That's a pretty moderate action, and that's probably why you like it. It kind of blows my mind when you start talking about these super fast action 3-weights. I mean, I just don't know why. I don't know what application that you would need a super fast action light line weight rod for. Because if you're fishing small streams up in North Carolina or Georgia or northern Michigan, most places that you fish a 3-weight, you're going to want that flex and that feel. But to each his own. I mean, I don't look down my
Sure.
nose at anybody and what they want to fish. But I think it's pretty fun to change people's minds when you put something different in their hands and they're like, wow, this is a lot of fun.
And I've got a 5-weight that's probably going to be sold fairly soon, and it's a nice rod, but I haven't fished it in forever, and part of that is because it's a lefty cray. It's the TICRX. It's a great rod. It's just a really fast action rod, and honestly, I haven't fished it because I don't have a lot of fun fishing it. It's just a bit too stiff for me to enjoy, but yeah, I'm considering selling that one to buy something else. But before I get off track too far,
well, I did that same thing. I mean, I think I had 6 or 8 different graphite rods and got into glass, and I started selling them off one by one and started picking up different rods and replacing them. So it happens. That's the process.
so do you? I have to ask the fiberglass guy. Do you still have any graphite fly rods, or you let them all go?
I've got one. I've got a 2-hander Echo Deck Hogan, which is a very moderate flex graphite rod, 2-hander. But I guess it's around because I haven't sold it, because I've got several Echo switch rods and 2-handers in glass now that really would be what I would pick up and fish. So I haven't fished that I haven't fished graphite in at least 10 or 12 years.
Well, I'm probably going to let that St. Croix go, but I'll be honest, I'm a long way from letting the 3-weight go. I really love that, but I am considering a 3-weight glass rod to go with it as a counterpart. I'll come back to that in a minute because we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. But so, Cameron, let's go through a couple scenarios here. First, I'll ask you if an aspiring fly fisherman, somebody that had not fly fished before, they're just getting ready to start. They don't know anything. If they came to you and asked for a recommendation, would you recommend glass, or would you recommend something more modern for a beginner?
Well,
and why?
I always recommend glass, just for the fact that I think it's a great tool to learn how to cast with. And they both enjoy how it casts, but then they really enjoy how it fishes. And so that's a great first experience for them. And I think that there's so many options that even if somebody starts out with a 4 or 5 weight, 3, 4 or 5 weight in glass, and then, as they learn more about fly fishing, maybe they're going to do bass or going to carp or something in salt, then if that same person came back to me and was like, hey, I've got a trip, I need an 8 weight, I don't know, I would give them glass options, but I'd also make sure that they go to a shop and they cast a lot of different rods to figure out what they like. I mean, I'm a total freak when it comes, and glass geek when it comes to fiberglass rods. So what I like may be different than what would be best to suggest to others. And, no hard feelings if they want to fish graphite. There are a ton of glass options now. I mean, literally hundreds of rods to choose from. So, and, the cool thing, especially for beginning anglers, is there's choices across all the price points. That Eagle Claw Featherlight is still available at, at hardware stores and at Walmart for $25, or you can break your piggy bank and get a fully customizable, one-of-a-kind fly rod and drop $1,200 or $1,500 or more dollars on it. So there's a tremendous amount of choices across that entire spectrum, which I think gives anglers a lot of choices. 10 years ago, if you wanted to fish a glass rod, I mean, it was you had a few things in the swimming pool of trout weights, and then you just had a couple things that kind of were outliers outside of that. Fast forward to now, and you just have an incredible amount of choices and at different price points. So you can find, a $30 3, 4, 5 weight, but then you can also spend 10 times that much if you actually 100 times that if you wanted to. So I think having choices is a pretty neat. And then within those choices, then you've got everything from very full flex parabolic rods to things that are more progressive in taper that they don't feel like graphite, but they're, going to be what's considered fast on the fiberglass side of things.
And you mentioned the Featherlight, and I know you do like that rod. Part of that, I think, is probably, and I'm not trying to speak for you, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of that's probably a little bit of nostalgia. But I do know you have those actually for sale on your website for folks that want to just try out a reasonably priced glass rod, right?
I do. They've been kind of hard to find lately. My local distribution forum is kind of dried up. The only reason I was offering them, I think I make $5 off each one that I sell, was just that people had such a hard time finding them that I was like, well, shoot, I'll just start selling them. And it's kind of fun to, I'll get a dad that emails and says, hey, I'm going to get one for me, but I'm going to get one for both my kids. And so it's fun to, have them report back how much fun that they've had on it. So it's been neat to help give people their first experience with either glass or fly fishing or both.
Sure. So, and this is the second part of that question I was going to ask, and this one is a bit loaded, so I'm gonna have to frame it a little bit, and you'll know why in just a second. But obviously, glass rods or really any fly rods for that matter, there's a really wide range of prices. You can spend as little or as much as your heart desires. So, if a person let's just use me for example. I've been fly fishing for many years. I definitely consider myself an accomplished amateur. I can go out and splash line with the best of them, but I catch fish and I enjoy myself. But if someone like me had been fishing with rod and reel combos in the $400 to $500 range and wanted just to try, for lack of a better term, a mid-range fiberglass rod, nothing that's going to break the bank, but nothing that's, kind of like an entry level, a good mid-range fiberglass rod. Do you have a couple of names you could drop as far as manufacturers that make just a good quality mid-range fly rod from a price perspective? Well,
the one that always tops out my list as far as just a factory made, you can go into a fly shop and find it and then walk out the door with it, is the Orvis Superfine Glass series. And the story behind it's pretty neat. The designer and the developer of that, before he even worked at Orvis, he and I got to know each other through TFM. We sent emails back and forth, and he would show me, pictures of fish that he'd caught on the bat and kill, big brown trout on glass. And he was doing something not in the fly fishing industry, and then he ended up getting hired by Orvis. And it wasn't too long after he started working at Orvis and he was working in fly rod development that he found some of the old Golden Eagle blanks in the rod shop. And he had a lot of guys at Orvis that really weren't that interested in doing a glass project. And he had a couple of the old blanks built up in the rod shop just to put them in hands of different people in the company, and just wanted to start conversations about it. And fast forward 6 months or a year, that conversations were happening more. And I don't know if there was a tremendous amount of confidence what superfine glass could be. But what they quickly found is that as the rods were being developed and people started hearing about it, there was a lot of excitement about it. And then when the rods were released, they had a tremendous response to it. So much so that the 3 rods that were in the lineup, which was a 7-foot 3-weight, a 7.6 4-weight, and an 8-foot 5-weight, were, a year later they added a 8.6 6-weight. They added another 3-weight to the lineup. And now, fast forward to now, and they're just about ready to launch a 2-weight and then an 8-weight. So it's kind of a neat story that they've had enough interest in that lineup that they wrote. It's been kind of a surprise to them, I think, that there was that much interest in it. But then just, the rods are made in the USA. They're rolled at the rod shop in Vermont. Everything's sourced from the USA, and so you're getting a Vermont-made fly rod for $400, and it has a full guarantee on it, and they're great tapers. They're a lot of fun to fish. So that's always, and I had kind of a hand in playing with prototypes and giving my opinion on maybe the aesthetics, and it was a neat project to be a part of. So that's always going to be my number one in that price point. I do get a lot of emails where people ask, like what should they be looking for? And I always ask 5 things. So the number one thing I ask is budget. Because I certainly don't want to talk to somebody about a $600 or an $800 fly rod when their budget's $200, or vice versa.
Sure.
So we talk about budget, we figure that out. Then we talk about line weight, what length, what's their application, like what type of taper are they looking for? Are they looking for that just perfect blue line brookies, in the backcountry, in the Appalachia, or are they looking for something for tailwater trout out west? And so we talk about line weight, length, type of taper, and then we talk about customer or factory. Do they have 3 months or 6 months to wait for a fly rod to be built for them? Do they want it to have those custom aspects that the different small shop rod builders can do, or do they have a trip coming up? They need to walk in, they need to grab it and go out the door. So usually, asking those 4 or 5 questions, you can really narrow down, exactly what's within their budget, what they're looking for. There's a lot of people that, USA made is very important to them. And then you talk to other guys that, they just want a great value, and a great fishing fly rod. So, and like I said, when I used to have conversations 10 years ago, it was pretty limited. You're either going to go to Mike McFarland or Mark Steffen for something custom, or you're going to go to Scott for something they offered, or Thomas, a established rod company. And there was a couple different blank makers, but the conversations were pretty limited. And fast forward now, and it's just like, well, you got this option, you got this option. If you
Sure.
you can spend about the same money and get this, or even companies like Cabela's have great fly rods for the money. The CGR series that they released years ago, and then kind of cycled off of them, but then brought them back because of demand. And there's times where they'll put those on sale for $40, and you can't beat that value for just a great fishing rod. And they offer 2 through 7/8 weight. So you've got lots of choices. And sometimes when somebody emails and says that they're looking for, they can't decide between multiple line weights, and maybe their budget's $200. My suggestion is wait till those Cabela's rods go on sale, and you can get the 2 weight, the 5 weight, and the 7/8 weight, and then you've got 3 rods for $120.
Wow.
And so it can be a deal, but it's a great entry into fishing glass and multiple line weights. And I guess the flip side of that is when this whole wave of contemporary glass started, there were some rod builders that I think were a little nervous about, some of, companies like, what Cabela's would do to them as a rod builder.
Sure.
Or some of the small rod shops, if some of the larger rod companies start offering glass. And what they quickly realized was, maybe that person that wants entry into fiberglass, they're not necessarily going to be the customer that's going to spend $400 or $600 or $800 on a custom rod, but they're going to start out with that, $50 or $60 or $80 rod. And then when they realize that they really enjoy it a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, when they're looking for something special, then they're going to become a customer to that custom rod builder, or to that, top tier rod company. And so what's been interesting, where you'd think that you'd have all this competition and rod builders wouldn't get along and rod companies wouldn't get along with the small shop rod builders, what's really happened is that some of the large end up rolling blanks for the smaller shop guys. Companies like Thomas & Thomas and Orvis, they sell their blanks to those rod builders. So there's guys that don't like the way the Orvis rods look. They don't like the build scheme, so they can get that blank and have a custom rod builder, and they're going to spend a couple $100 more for that blank, but they get it just the way they want it. And so, fast forward to now, and you see, the rod builders depend on and have great relationships with the larger rod companies, and they look at some of the entry-level glass as just a great opening of a door to people fishing glass. And a lot of times those same people become customers to the small shop rod guys too. So I think it's worked out. If you're a good builder and you do really good work, then people are they're gonna take notice, and you're not gonna have a problem selling rods. I traded text messages with rod builder today, and said he has a tremendous amount of orders and he can't build rods fast enough. And so that's pretty neat to hear.
It's very neat, and I think you have probably had a very large impact and influence on the resurgence of glass. Just based on the research that I've done in the Google searches I've done over the past 2 or 3 weeks. I think you've played a very large part in that. You mentioned the Orvis Superfine 3-weight, and I must admit I stopped at an Orvis shop today because I needed to get some Aqua Seal because my waders had a bit of seepage problem last week, and I'm hoping to fix them rather than having to replace them. But I picked up that 3-weight today, and it's an absolutely gorgeous rod. It's funny though, the gentleman that waited on me just kept saying, are you sure you don't want to? You wouldn't be more interested in this graphite? And I'm like, nah, not after my experience this past weekend. But now you just attended the Orvis Down the Hatch event in Nashville. I guess it was the week before last. Was there any new information or news about any glass offerings from Orvis during that time?
Well, a lot of the conversations right now with Orvis are all centered around H3. Helios 3, and that's their big launch.
Right.
They are rolling out the 2-weight and the 8-weight in the superfine glass. I mean, that's kind of a lesser story for them because essentially they're building or needing to build so many H3s right now that they don't even have table time in the rod shop to roll glass blanks and then finish out glass blanks because they've got so many orders for H3s that they're going to do a couple small runs of the 2-weight and the 8-weight, and then they'll probably get backburnered for a few months while they catch up with the H3s. Like, there's so many H3 orders and demand that they have people coming from the office that don't even work in the rod shop that are coming in to help do different aspects of the work in the rod shop just to move more rods out of there. So it's kind of hard to justify doing a big push on superfine glass right now when they've got that much interest in H3. I think what's interesting that you just said about, the guy in the shop saying, wouldn't you like to try, a graphite rod? Because I talked to a lot of fly shops, and Headhunters is a great example. And is a great example of a shop that gets glass. They enjoy fishing glass. The guys that are in the shop, when they're not fishing with clients, they're fishing glass themselves. So if you came into the shop and said, hey, I really want a glass 3-weight, they're going to have positive conversations with you about glass and their own experience with it. And you should try this. And we like this rod with this line. But then you go into other shops that they'll have, I've talked to some shop owners and they're like, we can't sell glass in our shop. Like, nobody's interested in it. Well, it's because when that person comes in and says, hey, I'm looking for, a 3 or a 4 or a 5-weight, the person that's in the shop isn't, if they're not into glass, they're gonna put a graphite rod in their hand every single time. Right. And when the customer says, well, what about this, that glass rod? And they're like, no, you don't want that. And so people are very swayed by what the shop guys tell them. So, what I have shops that are very glass friendly, that they have guides that fish glass, the shop guys fish glass, the owner fishes glass. It's a prominent thing in the shop, and it's something that they promote and they push, and they do casting competitions with them. And, they have just as many glass rods out at the casting pool as they do graphite rods. Then you see those shops that they're able to sell glass rods to, just about anybody that walks in the door that's looking for that type of rod. And then you find shops that they end up discounting the rods and getting rid of them because they don't have anybody in the shop that's passionate about it. And that's, whether you're at a fly fishing blog or you work in a fly shop or you're a rep for, one of the rod makers, if you get it, then other people are going to get it. But if you're not keen on it, then it's hard to, get other people to be excited about something that you're ho-hum about.
And you know what, Cameron, you're exactly right. The shop today that I was in, you could just tell that was his comfort zone was around the graphite, and that's cool. And I'm not necessarily even saying that I'm at the point yet where I may not buy another graphite rod at some point, but yeah, I really like that superfine 3-weight. And I know when we were talking a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned the 2-weight that was coming, and I got really excited about it because I've been wanting a 2-weight. But then I mentioned the guy on Facebook, and his name is Scott Spray. I'm not sure if you have ever ran into him or know him, but this little rod that he built is really nice. And In fact, he told me after I got it and tried it out that he has a 6 foot. He has a 6 foot blank, so I'm thinking about having him actually build that one for me too at some point. I'm in no hurry, but I still think I'm going to end up probably now. If I get that super fine, it'll be the 3 weight instead of the 2 that I was talking to you about. So I can actually go pick that up anytime. All I got to do is come up with that little bit of $400 to do it.
Just need that cash.
That's all. It's what makes the world go round, isn't it?
Sure.
So shifting, I want to shift just a little bit. You kind of started talking a little bit about the custom rods, and that's for me, that's a little bit of a black hole. I've tried to do a little bit of research. I've talked to a couple of custom rod builders. I would say again, they're more the independent guys, the mom and pop shops, those kind of things. But if you're looking at having a custom fly rod built by a custom rod maker, are there name brand blanks that you look for, or some of the no name blanks just as good? I guess what do you look for there if you're looking at a custom rod? Is it all about reputation, or is it about materials, a combination, or what?
Well, I mean, that's changed a lot over the years. So when you back up 10 years ago, there was only a couple sources to get rods as far as rod blanks for custom rod builders. So there was a time where you had Mike McFarland. He was building his own rods, but he was selling his blanks. And then you had Mark Steffen, who was doing the same thing. He'd build rods, but he would also sell his blanks. So you had a growing number of small shop rod builders who were typically getting their blanks from, either of them, or they would find old blanks, on eBay and build those up. But there wasn't a lot of choices. And fast forward to now, and you've got builders that have developed a reputation either by building on other people's blanks. So they're building still on the Steffen blanks or the McFarland blanks or Epic blanks, or they're getting blanks from Thomas & Thomas or from Orvis, or they're the step beyond that is that you've got rod builders that have their own interest in developing tapers. So you've got the Larry Kennys, and you've got Fred Paddock and Shane Gray and Chris Barclay, and the list goes on, where these guys have done their own research on what they are looking for in a fiberglass rod. They've developed tapers, they have their own mandrels, and then they have found sources for where that glass is made. Some of it's made in the U.S., some of it's made in New Zealand, some of it's made in Japan. So there's different places that rod builders are able to source rods that are made specifically for them, to their own taper, to their own specifications. And I think the neat part of that is that, again, there was a time where I think rod builders were constantly looking over their shoulder like, well, so-and-so's doing an 8-foot 5 weight and I'm doing an 8-foot 5 weight. I wonder how similar our rods are. Over time, what that's developed into is that when you look at somebody like Chris Barclay, his rods, he's very much into parabolic style rods. And for the most part, his rods were in the lower trout weight. So he did 2s and 3s and 4s and a 5, and he kind of stopped there. Now he's extending that into a 6 weight and a 7 weight and an 8 weight. But the style of his rods are very, and then you look at what Shane Gray has done over time, and he's had several different signature lineups of fiberglass that he's done, and some graphite, where what he was doing didn't conflict with what Chris was doing, because Shane's rods were all about kind of pushing glass to being longer rods. So one of the rods that I've got from him is a 9-foot 3 weight. A very full flexing, but a long rod that you could use in tailwater situations, on chalk streams, kind of a specialized rod. Mm-hmm. And so what Shane was doing was different from Chris, but then you go and you look at the rods that are coming out of Japan, and those are different than what the other two guys are doing. And then you look at Larry Kenny, and he was doing a 5-piece back rod, and his tapers are notorious as well and well known. So instead of all these custom rod builders kind of being at odds with each other, what they've done is they've all found their niche, what they're good at, what they like. Mario Wojcicki, he has his own deal. He's probably more akin to Chris Barclay as far as parabolic rods. And so what you've had is that you've got all these different rod builders that have developed their own identity, what they do, how they build a rod. It might be aesthetics. And so I think I think for a rod builder, kind of the slap in the face is if you contact one rod builder and say, hey, I'd like you to build this rod that looks very much like a rod that comes out of another shop. And that happens. People don't know that that's kind of like not cool to do. But, rod builders will kind of laugh at it, like, yeah, they wanted me to build it, but they wanted me to do it kind of in the style of another builder. And they typically won't do that.
Sure. So not to try to nail you down here, but I guess, if you let's use the Superfide as an example. So that's roughly a $400 rod. If a person went out and spent $400 with a custom rod builder, could they expect to get a similar performance rod from the custom rod builder in most cases as they would from, say, an Orvis? Or is that really too hard to say?
Well, I don't know if it's too hard to say. I mean, everything breaks down to what the blank is. And what you do find, and I've written a couple of articles on it, like there's a lot of people that are drawn to fiberglass because of the color. And I'll even get people that will email me and say, I want a green fly rod, or I want a blue fly rod, or I want a pink fly rod. They're not answering the question of what they're going to do with the rod. Like they're buying that rod and wanting that rod purely off aesthetics. And so what you kind of try to do is then I still go back to my 5 questions, like what's your budget, what's your line length, what is your line weight that you're looking for, and what type of taper we're looking for. Because if somebody wants a bright yellow fly rod, or a very traditional like dark yellow fly rod, or a green, and they say, well, I'm going to be using it for a situation where I might be fishing streamers or whatever, and they want something more progressive, then I'm going to say, well, one of the Epic rods is going to be a great choice because they've got the color that you want and the taper that you want. And so you can kind of match up what they want together. Some people are very drawn to the aesthetics of it, and they don't necessarily care how the rod casts. And I've done that. I mean, years ago, I would buy rods just because I liked how they looked. And then I'd get them, and they didn't fit the way the fishing that I did or wanted to do with them. And so they would be rods that I would end up passing on to someone else because they didn't apply to the fishing that I do. The other definition that I like to kind of explain to people is that it's very easy to say, oh, they're a custom rod builder. Well, are they a custom rod builder or are they a rod builder? Because it's not terribly difficult, and there's rod builders that are very, very good and they do excellent work, but they are buying preformed grips. The hardware is coming from another source. The guides are coming from, like everything that's building that rod comes from somewhere else. So essentially they're a rod builder, but they're a rod putter together type deal. But for somebody that's looking for a truly custom fly rod, there are rod builders that they do everything. If you look at the work of Matt Lederman, he does all of his metal work. He can do his guides. He does all of his woodwork. He does sources the highest grade cork that he could possibly do or find, and then he builds a fly rod that is largely from his own hands and from his shop and from the tools and from the equipment in his shop. And so that definition of what a custom rod builder is going to be different than that guy that really isn't doing the customization part of the build. They're essentially just taking parts and putting them together. So I wouldn't expect, if somebody was going to drop $600 or $800 on a fly rod, well, you can get a very bespoke, handcrafted fly rod from somebody like Shane Gray or George in Europe, or from Christian in Sweden, or from Matt Lederman. I would hope that somebody that's a rod putter together rod builder would not try to pass off his work as being $600 or $800 work to the same level as somebody that's done so much of that work out of their own shop.
And that makes perfect sense.
And, that just takes research, and I think when people start getting into the idea of having a custom rod built for them, people do a lot of research, and there's, I hope that TFM's a resource for people. Of course, I get a lot of emails, and I'm happy to walk people through the different things. And what's fun is, when people answer those 5 questions that I give them, then they might want a small shop made rod, but they might not be able to afford something that's very handcrafted, but they still want something from the United States, and I'm able to link them up with a builder that builds beautiful rods, and it's exactly what they want. And so, it's great having those emails where we can have conversations about what they're looking for, and then line them up with the exact either rod company or fly shop that sells the rod they're looking for, or either a rod maker or then a very custom rod maker, and then to get feedback from them, like, man, that was exactly what I was looking for. It's rewarding, and I get a kick out of it. And it's pretty neat to, even like highlight a rod builder on TFM and then have that rod builder, send me a text message or an email a couple days later and say, hey, appreciate you putting up that, that Stefan build. I ended up selling 3 more rods, from people that saw that post. So it's a
cool.
feel good thing for me that I feel like I'm doing my part in fly fishing to promote both rod builders, but then also like connect people together.
Sure. And I was sitting here thinking, listening to most of that, basically the moral of that story comes down to get out there, spend some time on the Fiberglass Manifesto, do some research if you're looking at buying a rod or having a custom rod made. And if you got questions, sounds like you're open to folks reaching out to you and asking advice.
And I always tell people, jump on the Fiberglass Flyrodders Forum. Like I said, I was a member when there was less than 300 members. I was just on there tonight, and there's over 6,000 members on that forum.
Wow.
And what's cool is that you've got people that have fished glass for decades and decades and decades, but then not only have fished glass, but they've worked at Fenwick, or they've worked at Shakespeare,
right,
or they worked with Tom Morgan, or they worked at Winston, or they worked at, we had a rod builder that worked at the Vermont Rod Shop. I mean, people with incredible backgrounds and knowledge base. And, there's rod makers on the forum. There's a lot of rod makers on the forum, actually. And so it's a really neat place to ask questions. If somebody emails me about a vintage rod that they found, I can give them, typically some information, but I always say on Fiberglass Flyrodders, because there are people there that actively want to help you understand what you've got there. And there's some great conversations on that forum. And what's also neat is that if somebody's looking for something, and even in my own experience, that my first glass rod was a Eagle Claw Featherlight. The next glass rod that I bought when I joined the forum, there's a guy that's named Bulldog, 1935, Ron from Texas. He posted a 7-foot Hedden brown tobacco glass fly rod, and he sold it for $45. So he was barely selling it. He was barely selling it for any money. I bought the rod, and that rod blew my mind. In fact, the story that I always tell is at that same time that I got that Hedden, my wife, I had turned 30 years old, and my wife had saved all year, and I told her that I was looking for this, that I wanted this one specific graphite rod. And what was mind-blowing, but then also getting kicked in the gut, is that $650 graphite rod was not a fraction as fun to fish as that $45 7-foot glass rod.
Isn't that amazing?
And so, it was a tough thing to come to terms with, that this $45 rod that was at that point probably 50 years old,
right,
just so much more fun to fish than this modern graphite rod. So it was eye-opening to me. But I guess that for sale forum on the Fiberglass Flyrodders is great, because even I'll get rid of stuff. I could probably jump on eBay and make twice the money, but everybody in that community, they just want that. Whatever they have, they want it to go to somebody else that will appreciate it. And what's kind of neat is that there's so many people on the forum that are kind of going through the different stages of fishing glass. So when you come on the forum, you're like buying everything up. You want to figure out what you like. You're buying vintage. You're buying, contemporary if you can afford it. Maybe you don't have much of a budget, and then you get all these rods, and then you figure out, ooh, I really like the way this feels. You keep this one. You sell these 3, but it goes on to kind of somebody else's experience. And so what you find is a real community where you see some of the same things get sold and resold and resold, and it's not that they're subpar or that they're not wanted. It's just that it's neat to kind of pass on those things. As you kind of grow out of them, they go to somebody else. And so there's a real culture on that forum of most people will not sell on eBay. They want to sell on the forum because they kind of want to, it's kind of do the right thing type mindset.
Sure. And I can tell you, I'm not a member, but I will be signing up. If not tonight, I will be registering an account on that forum tomorrow. Cameron, I'll be honest with you, buddy. I could probably sit here and talk to you for another 2 hours, but probably ought to look at wrapping this one up. But the good news is I've still got questions, so maybe we'll do this again sometime in the future. I tell you what, it was an absolute pleasure having you on the show. I hope to meet up with you again on a stream sometime real soon. Tell you what, you picked the state. How about that?
I know we need to plan. I don't think you're too far away. You're in Georgia, right?
That's correct. I'm one state line away from you.
You can't be too far away because I'm in the middle of South Carolina, so we're not too far away from the state line. So, but it's been great to talk to you. Hopefully I hadn't gone off on too many tangents and answered the questions that you had. And of course, if anybody has any questions, they can feel free to email me at the Fiberglass Manifesto at gmail.com, or you can connect through the website or Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I try to stay active on those social media sites as well.
Awesome, buddy. Well, I sure do appreciate it again, and can't wait to talk to you again. Until the next time, I sure hope everyone enjoyed this episode and that you're enjoying the podcast. We've got some other great guests, just like Cameron, already lined up and headed your way in the coming weeks. So if you've not already done so, please subscribe to the podcast so you'll automatically be notified of future episodes. And we can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Podbean, and more. Once you subscribe, please take the time to leave us a rating or a review. This helps us climb in the ratings and attract new listeners to the podcast. And the more folks we have listening, the more people we have the opportunity to introduce to our traditional style of doing things. So until next time, get out there and enjoy our great outdoors. And if you can, take a kid along. Be safe, be responsible, and be sure to set a good example for your fellow outdoors men and women. So long, everyone.